Welcome to the Living Wholehearted podcast, where we're helping leaders live with integrity.
Whether you're a single parent or a CEO, you're a leader, and how you lead matters.
Welcome back to part 2 with KathyGrace Duncan. Now, if you're just tuning in, you have to go back and listen to part 1 because we're going to just pick up where we left off. And I just want you to have the context of her story. KathyGrace is currently the women's ministry leader at Portland Fellowship, where she facilitates discussion groups, co-leads a small group, mentors, and teaches with the Taking Background program. She's also chairman of the board, or on the board of the Portland Fellowship. And she actually lived as a man for 11 years and reclaimed her birth name 27 years ago, is now living as a female. KathyGrace, I know that many who hear your story and the work that you do wonder if it's harmful to people to be saying that you lived as a man, you dated women, and now that you are no longer living in that lifestyle. Many might think that that's actually harmful in today's culture. Would you speak to that a little bit more?
You know, coming out of the lifestyle, I realized for those 11 years, now I wouldn't have known this without the Lord revealing it to me, but those 11 years that I lived as a man, I actually lived in a very, there was a big depth of fear that I lived in because I was always scared that somebody was going to find out about who I was. So I was always looking ahead to make sure my tracks would be covered, looking behind to make sure my tracks were covered. And then I was just deceived about a lot of things as far as who I was. There was so much deception. And then coming out of that, as I look back, I was like, wow, I had no idea the fear that I lived in. I had no idea the deception that I lived in. I had no idea the rejection and the abandonment and those things that were undealt with that pain drove me into that deception. And so now living as a woman, there's a freedom that I'm experiencing and have experienced that I didn't experience as a man, even though I took the hormones and I thought I was free. And now I finally arrived. I hadn't. I had actually, kind of, I don't even know how to describe that. I guess I would say I'd gone backwards as far as finding freedom. And so now being in the truth and living free, I can't say that it was harmful. It's not harmful. We have to look at those things, those root issues that get us there, because that's really what brought me freedom. Now, was it hard to look at some of those things? Yeah, absolutely, because there was pain I had to look at. There was pain I had to face, truth I had to embrace, and lies I had to discard. And sometimes that was really hard because it was the lie that all I knew. That was my basis for life. Those were my friends. And trying to embrace the truth and figure out how to displace the lies, can be a real challenge. But, it goes back to, well, what do you want? Do you want to be free, or do you want to live in this deception? Do you want to know what Christ has for you, or do you want to not, basically?
Yeah, there's so much there, and you're using the word root. You talked about it in your story, and you're talking about it now. That rings so true as somebody who works at a root level. I mean, often people will come to our practice and we just say from the get-go, if you want to pluck at weeds, we're not the right fit for you. But if you really are ready to dig up those roots, which means it might look a little messy for a while, then we're the right fit, because honestly, the weeds keep coming back until you get the roots pulled. So talk a little bit more about what are you saying when you say I needed to get to the roots? What are the roots of your story, as well as many that you work with and walk alongside?
Sure. So one of the things that I discovered is, and I mentioned this before, is that, being transgender was really not the issue. The whole LGBTQ way of living it's not a sexual issue, it's a relational issue. And so as I began to walk through my stuff and look at those roots, I found rejection was in there. I found abandonment was in there, emotionally and physical. And I found abuse was in there. There was verbal abuse, there was physical abuse, and there was sexual abuse. And so it was looking at those things and the things that they said to me dealing with the rejection and realizing that, I I was valuable. They just didn't know how to love me the way I needed to be loved.
Mm.
And then also seeking to see, because we all have legitimate needs. Parents help take care of those legitimate needs. And if they go unmet, we're going to go out and we're going to get those needs met. And one of those needs is to be
Mm.
loved. I just wanted to
Yeah.
be loved. And I thought to be acceptable and to be loved and lovable and be valued, I had to live as a man because everything else told me being a woman was unsafe. I would be hated. I was vulnerable. And so I didn't want to live that way. I didn't want to think that those things would be true of me. So I'm going to go and I'm going to have those needs met. And that pain from the rejection and the abandonment and the abuse drove me to find ways of having that pain subside, finding my medication. I drank a lot. I didn't do drugs, but I drank a lot to numb that pain.
Mm.
And then also that need to be loved. I was always searching. So, what girl can I date that's going to tell me that she loves me so I can be whole? And really, that's kind of emotional cannibalism in a way because you're taking from their emotional, what they have in their emotional tank to fill yours because yours is so functioning at a deficit. And so looking at those roots, rejection, abuse, and abandonment were the main three. And, rejection kind of runs through everything. And
Mm.
I also had to understand too that, a lot of my rejection could have been just perceived. I mean, I had a lot of real rejection, but that was a big deal looking at the rejection because I got rejection from my dad as well as the emotional and physical abandonment. My dad was there, but he was never available. And the same thing with my mom. I didn't have the nurturing that I should have had as a child. And so I went out in search of that in women. And in dating women, they were all very nurturing. And that's a relational need that we get from our parents. And
Yeah.
so those deficits, that I was functioning from, I was trying to get them filled, and it didn't have anything to do with sex, but relationships.
It's so important, I think, to keep saying that over and over because for some reason we think this is a whole separate issue. But from my 15 years of working in private practice, I've been processing the dynamics of identity with, as well as orientation, and for years behind in the confidential room. And so, what you're saying feels so true for the many that I've sat with, the many you've sat with in your own story, and even just in my story. I've never identified within the LGBTQ plus categories, but I mean, I think a lot of us can resonate with the pieces of hurt from rejection and abandonment, or just the confusion, the deceptions we have about ourselves, and it leaks out in funky ways. One of the questions that I often get, so I'm going to put it on your plate. You help us understand the common questions are, well, not everybody has abuse or the family dynamics or a story where there's been abandonment, rejection, neglect. I know somebody that didn't happen, or that's not me. Speak to that a little bit. What is your thoughts about that statement that many people will come forward and say, yeah, I don't fit, or that doesn't fit in this category?
Sure. So I did have parents come to me and they were like, well, my child grew up in a really loving home and we loved him and, we laid our lives down for our kids and all of this. And I said, yeah, but there's got to be a place of trauma somewhere. There has to be something that was perceived that, maybe wasn't the way that you meant it, but that's how they perceived it. And it did damage to them. And, not every parent, even the best parents, we all lack something somewhere. And so they're going to go and try to get that met. And I happened to talk to this guy who I've known for a long time. He lived as a woman, and then he came out of that. And I asked him, I said, your parents loved you. They loved you. They tell me that they loved you. So why did you want to live as a woman? I mean, why? Your parents loved you. And he's like, yeah, they did love me. And he said, but there was one day when he was 4, he was watching his dad play with his little sister, not having the tools to be able to understand that, it's not that his dad loved him less or his sister more, but he was just playing with his sister differently. So as he watched his dad play with his sister, he was like, wow, in order for my dad to love me like that, then maybe I should be a girl, because then she will love me. And boom, the lie enters in right there. That's his place of trauma. Now, does it seem like a big deal? No, it doesn't. But yes, it is, because that lie begins to birth in him, and it begins to grow a belief system in him. And now that's all he sees through is, if I would have been a girl, then I would have this. And, we have an enemy out there, because this really isn't all about flesh. It's about the enemy out there trying to destroy identity as well. And so the enemy is going to take advantage of that. And everything that he sees now, the enemy is going to say, yeah, see, you should have been a girl. Look, you missed out on that. Oh, and look at that. You know what? Your sister gets to do that and you don't, because you're a boy. See, if you would have been a girl, you could have had that. And so, so from there, he begins to detach from his parents because of that lie that's in there. And he believes that he's not loved, he's not valued. To have this affirmation, he needs to be a girl. And so in some cases, they will begin to act out as a girl. And of course, they get rejected because, they're trying to act out. They don't understand that, the parents don't understand that, oh, my kid, there's something wrong here. And the kid doesn't understand why his parents are rejecting him, because he thought that that's what would have gotten him the ultimate affirmation. And so there's a disconnect there. And again, it doesn't seem like that's a big deal, but it's through the child's eyes. And I think in the parents that I've worked with, they have their perception of what is good, but to the child, was that good? Because they have a whole different filtering system. They're a whole independent thinker. And even though we meant it, in a good way, it could be that they interpret it a different way. And that's temperament as well. They're wired to think and do things a certain way. And our best intentions sometimes are misinterpreted. So, and again, I think too that sometimes there's abuse, and maybe it's not as overt, or it's not out there. It hasn't been sexual in nature, but maybe somebody showed him pornography, and that's all it took, and that's sexual abuse. And so sometimes I think we categorize things as these big things, when really it's these really small things that take the biggest root.
Yeah, and I want to validate that just from most abuse survivors. The very first thing we would say is, "What abuse? I wasn't abused." So I think we have to take that into account as well when we're sharing our stories with one another. You have to be really aware and have done a lot of work to be able to call things what they are. And we are scared of that word because we do think it has to be overt. We've got connotations with it, but trauma and confusion and all kinds of things develop in our story. I mean, I have a simple story of when I was in kindergarten, KathyGrace, and I remember going out to recess, and one of my friends tells me she wants a blue crayon, and we're not allowed to go in to get into the classroom. And I went because she asked me. I was like a good little friend. So I go in, I get in trouble because I went and got the crayon, and my name goes on the board. Okay, small, minor thing, but that is in my timeline as a key marker of major shame that set me on a trajectory of being a people pleaser. And I stopped. I mean, there's all kinds of things in our story. And I remember when I came across that story as significant, I just couldn't believe that made a mark. So just recognizing that there's a lot in our stories that are playing in, and part of the healing journey of all of us is to recognize and to take the time to know our stories, to actually pay attention to them, to tell another, to let God into all of that. So I hear that's what you're trying to say. It's not clear cut, like this had to happen in order for this to be the case. But in our current culture, KathyGrace, it just seems, well, I'm being told, and I'm watching this happen, and just a continual confusion, but there just seems to be more and more stories of people coming out or, at very young ages. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So in watching this as well, I think there is some confusion or maybe misnaming. So transgender seems to get a lot of things put in there as far as the whole gender dysphoria and gender identity issues. And I actually think there's two separate things going on. So there's the transgender person who, like myself, has struggled since like before kindergarten, because I started like way before I went to kindergarten, even before I understood really what gender was. There was this thing that I was like, as far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a boy. That was my biggest desire. And my mom would tell me, when you were 2, we'd try to put a dress on you and you would kick and scream and fight and cry. And I was like, wow, really? So even way back then, I was fighting being a girl and wanting to be a boy. So there's the gender dysphoria, those who really struggle with their identity. And there's a whole bunch of things that go in that. Then I think there's another culture that we're seeing, or another group, if you will, that we're seeing that is actually just gender confusion. I don't mean just gender confusion, but it's gender confusion, and it's being mislabeled as gender dysphoria and put in under the transgender. Now, I'm not saying it's not transgender, but it's more gender confusion. And what I'm seeing is that it's mostly girls, and usually when they reach puberty, like the age of 13, sometimes as late or as early as 12 and as late as 15, they're in this puberty thing and they think that they should be boys because I think that's a natural thing for children. Am I a girl? Am I a boy? I want to be a boy because boys get this. I want to be a girl because whatever. And so they're growing up, and puberty is a really confusing time. Your body's changing, you're changing, there's just all these things that are going on. And without the proper affirmation of who they are, and letting them know, no, you're a beautiful woman, I see you as a girl, those types of things, without the parents in there, helping that child to understand, no, you're created this way and this is really good. They think that being a boy is better. And so they begin to take on these roles. And then after the puberty era is over, basically, or they're beginning to come out of that, like age 18, 19, some as late as 21, 22, they realize, no, I really do like being a girl. And so we're seeing a lot of those kids that transitioned in, this big group of people are now coming out of that because they realize, no, I really am happy with who I am biologically. I really do want to be that girl. And so I think we throw them all under rather than researching that and saying, well, why? Why do you want to be a boy? We just look at them and we go, oh, you want to be a boy? Okay, well, let's do the puberty blockers. Let's give you hormones. Let's do this. Let's, sign you up for top surgery, and then we'll discuss the bottom surgery. They put all these things because that's the cure, rather than asking them the question, well, why do you think this is true about you? Why do you want to do this? Why do you think this is better? What is wrong with being a girl for you? They don't look at those underlying issues that we talked about previously. They don't look at, what's telling you that being a woman is bad or being a man is better. And there is a tremendous amount of peer pressure out there. One of the stories I read about a girl, she transitioned living as a man at the age of, I think, 14. She came out when she was 22, and now she had taken 7 years of hormones, and that's destructive. I was on it for 11, and there's consequences for that. And, her voice is deeper now, but she's like, I really want to be this girl. But now, I've had top surgery and there's been all this mutilation to my body, and that's really not what I wanted. But because I voiced that I think being a boy is better, I was pushed into this direction, saying, yes, let's do this for you, rather than going, oh, really? Okay, wait, well, why is that? Rather than looking back and helping that child, that person, to look at, the reasons why they want to be there and maybe how they got there. They're just pushing them into going, okay, let's just do this, rather than, looking at maybe what is the real problem here, and maybe what you're offering isn't the real solution. It's not the right one. So that's what I'm seeing in the culture happening. And again, I say it's mostly girls that's having this gender confusion placed to than it is boys. Now, there are boys that are doing it. And I haven't read too many articles on this, but they're also saying that these kids are on the autism spectrum. And I don't quite understand how that plays into that. But that's what I'm hearing. I don't have a quite good enough understanding to really speak into that. So
Yeah.
that's one of my things to begin to study.
Well, I think a couple key things that you're pointing to is just as parents and leaders of these children, they need someone to continue to tell them who they are, that they're beautiful, that they're valuable. And when that's missing, we're normally going to look for that. And oftentimes just because of the pressures or again, not wanting to be a bad parent. So I think there's a lot of parents that just think they're doing the right thing. They might
Mm-hmm.
encourage when their kid comes to them and says, I feel this way or I think this way. And they want to love them right where they're at and not asking those hard questions, or maybe recognizing this as the continuum process of development. The brain is changing, the body is changing, the insecurities are enormous. There might be things happening in the story outside of family that's playing a role. So just slowing down the process instead of rushing, because we can end up doing more trauma and damage long term with how many kids are coming to and it's normal around the lunch table, to ask those kinds of questions about each other. So there's this peer pressure that's happening at the lunch table that wasn't happening 10, 15 years ago. And I know, KathyGrace, probably when you were a kid, that was very different. So you hid it, but now you don't have to hide.
Right.
But these kids are still discovering who they are. And so I think it's really important for us to slow down and not to be fearful as
Well,
parents. So I'll just speak as a parent. I can just hear all the parents I've sat with that just have grieved. So let's talk to that parent. The ones that have come to you, KathyGrace, what do you tell them when their child is coming to them, their teen, and saying, I think I'm a boy, or I think I'm a girl, or I'm bisexual, and they're 13. Speak to that parent.
yeah, that is always a hard one. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I try to let them know that, they are at the beginning of their journey and what they're reaching for right now is really attractive to them. So they might not stop reaching for a while. And to when and to understand too that this child has been carrying this for a while. They've been ruminating on this, they've been researching it, they've been fantasizing about it. So when they come to you, it's either because they want you to know or they can no longer hold it in and they want to do something about it. Um, and if they're really secretive and they don't want your approval or they don't want you to know, they'll wait till they move out and then they'll drop it like a bombshell on you. And I think as a parent, you have to understand that they have already been thinking about this. Like I said, they've been fantasizing about it and they've probably been planning it. And so it's okay when they come to you and they have that expectation on you to understand in the moment, that day that they just told you, it's okay to say to them, okay, can you give me a couple of days to think about this? Because I'm hearing about this for the first time today. And this isn't something that we've talked about already. So, if you want to talk about it, I'm happy to sit here and talk about it with you. But I do need room to process this because this is all new to me. And then rather than laying on them what you believe they should be doing, ask them questions. Again, the why. Why do you want to do this? Knowing that they may not know because they're reaching for that deception. Because that deception is the forbidden fruit and they want it with all their heart. I can tell you, been there, did that. And nobody was going to talk me out of that. And so I think that the most effective thing that you can do is pray for your child. And I had a mom, I was talking with her and she's like, that's great. You always say, are you praying for him? Are you praying for him? And I am, but I'm not seeing any fruit of that. I don't think God's listening. And I said, well, why don't you think God's listening? She goes, well, because he's not changing. And I said, well, how long are you willing to pray for them? How long are you willing to wait for the Lord's word? Because it took 11 years for me. Your
Mm.
son's only been doing this for 6 months. How long are you willing to pray? She's like, oh, okay. And, we do have to give space for God to work, and it may not look like you want it to look like, and
Mhm.
honestly, there may come a point where you have to let him go. You have to let him go into that lifestyle so they can find out how miserable they really are, even though they tell you, "Oh, I'm so happy." I look back on that and I'm like, I thought I was, but, there was a lot of stuff in there that wasn't so great. And so you may have to let them go into that and understand, though, that even when they are in the depth of their deception, doing the things you never thought that they would ever do, God's arm is not too short to save. It really isn't. I mean, He pulled me out of the mud and the mire, so I know He can do that for your child. And it's also, too, important to not try to fix them, because when you do that, you're making them a project. They've just become a project. And when it's important for you to fix them, then you've just made their process about you, because you're going to be
Mm.
the one that fixes them. Well, actually, no, God's going to be the one that has to do that. And, be gracious if you can. And I know it's hard because sometimes they come at you because they're angry, they're mad, they're wounded, they're painful. And if you can think of it as like a tiger or a lion that's got a thorn in his paw, it hurts. And the lion doesn't understand why it hurts. He just knows that it hurts. And he doesn't understand that you're trying to pull the thorn out. And in the process of pulling that thorn out, you're causing him more pain. And so it's the same type of thing with the child. They got this wound in there and they're trying to express it. They're trying to be understood. But in the meantime, they're angry. And that anger only exemplifies that there's something underneath that. There's a greater pain. That anger is only a symptom of a greater pain that's there. And so they may not be angry at you. They may be. I don't know. Let me put it this way. They may or may not be angry with you, but it's your response to that anger is what's going to make the difference.
Mm.
And I've seen parents respond and go, I'm sorry that you feel that way. I am so sorry that you feel that way, but let's unpack that, and if I have fault in that, I will take my responsibility. But they need to be heard. That was one of the things that I didn't have, is I wasn't heard. I didn't have a voice. And
Mm.
so they need a place to have a voice. And you may not like what that voice says to you, and it may be hard, but it's also taking what they have said to you and taking it before the Lord and asking the Lord, do I have responsibility in this? Because it's powerful, absolutely powerful, when a parent goes to the child and said, you know what? I missed it. I did miss
Mm.
that. Will you forgive me? Now, I
Mm.
didn't get that from my parents, but I had people who stood in the gap for me. Tremendous amount of healing, and it helped me to move forward. And so, if as much as you are able, even if you believe to the nth degree, that is not my fault, I know that that is your perception. Take it before the Lord and see what He says. Is there a way, even if it wasn't your fault, is there a way for you to still apologize for that without taking responsibility necessarily, but
Mm.
saying, yeah, I'm sorry that happened. I'm so sorry that
Mm.
that was so painful for you. How do I walk with you now through that?
Oh, wow.
And
How do I walk with you now? Yeah. So
yeah,
it's being willing to hear your child's narrative, whether they're 13 or they're 35 or 55, to be able to hear that narrative, to be able to hear their story, to be able to stand with their anger, not being beat up by it, but definitely having courage to stand and to love them, and then to own the things that you can own, that you can recognize looking back. I mean, every parent makes mistakes along the way, and yet there's some significant ones that it's really important to repair. And you're talking about the power that has been in your own life. I love how you talk about there's been others that have stood in the gap for your parents when they couldn't do that. And that is profound too. That's part of God's covering there. Kathy Grace, there's just so much, and I'm sad that we're coming to an end, but I want you to maybe explain, maybe just with this last piece, what does grace look like in the middle of all of this topic? There's so much we didn't cover, but this is really front and center, and honestly, one of the most polarizing issues right now, especially in the church and in our culture. And it's just concerning. I mean, no matter what side of the coin, there's just a lot of harm being done in both places and a lot of confusion. So tell us what grace looks like in the midst of all of this.
I would say grace is, from the Lord, the patience that He gave me. And, the people who walked with me, I believe that they saw what I did, understanding that's not who I am. They were able to, it's like this is a behavior, but that behavior doesn't define you. And that's one of the things that the Lord has taught me in working with others is, yeah, that's what you did, but that's not who you are. That wasn't the best choice you could have made, and maybe you could have made a different one, and but we can work on that. But that's not who you are. You're not bad because of that choice. Yes, you need to make a better one. Okay, and yeah, you might have consequences for that, but that choice doesn't define you. God is the only one who defines you. And it's helping them to understand that all these things that you did in your past doesn't define you. And I believe that that's grace, and helping them to understand that, the Lord's not going to hold that in front of your face the next step you take and go, yep, I knew it. You made that choice just before, and look, you're going to make that choice again. The Lord's like, no, come with me. He offers a different solution. And so it's trying to look beyond what they're doing, what they've done, what they're saying, and speak into who they are, because really that's what they need to hear. Mm. And, sitting with them, saying, I'm sorry, hearing their stuff, asking questions, and not always offering our opinion, because it's not always what they need necessarily, because it was in the questions that I made the discovery of what the truth was, not what they told me.
Wow, that's powerful. It was, and you have to have room for that. You have to be present for that, right?
Yes. Yes.
So thank you, Kathy Grace. I am just so humbled. I just feel like I'm sitting, well, you're on the phone, but I feel like I'm just sitting at sacred space here. There's just, your story reminds me so much of just the goodness of who God is and His patience for us, and how much He loves and delights in us. And you're right. Mm-hmm. He isn't shaking his finger or looking the other way. And I just so much want to be that in the lives of others. And I'm calling our listeners to be that too. And we can only do that when we know that we too are loved, that He sees us this way. And He isn't looking at our behaviors. And yet, the more we understand how known and loved we are, the more we can let go and really be transformed. And I'm just overwhelmed. So thank you so much. And I want to be able to provide more resources. So look in our bio. One resource I'm going to just say right now is Courageous Girls. Part of the many things that Kathy Grace shared of children needing to be seen, needing to be heard, having safety, knowing their value and their worth, being able to validate their the changes going on in their bodies and their uniqueness, and being delighted in. Those are profound things that us parents are sanctioned to do in our children's lives, and we just get wrapped up and busy in the mundane stuff, and we have our own stories that gets in the way. So Courageous Girls is a free online curriculum at mycourageousgirls.com. It's helping moms to do their own work and their own story, as well as how do I walk alongside my daughter from second grade all the way through her senior year of high school, really helping fan the flame of who she is and who God says she is, with grace, and having those hard conversations, but learning to listen to her, giving her a place to be heard and to ask those questions. I love that. So thank you so much, Kathy Grace.
Yes.
And until next time, thank you for joining us in the movement to shrink our integrity gaps between who we say we are and how we're actually living. It is not easy, but it's a noble pursuit. None of us do it perfectly, but Jesus. But thank you so much for his grace. Thank you for joining us in being a leader committed to shrinking the integrity gap between the values we espouse and the values we actually live out in practice.